So yesterday, we took a few minutes to kind of define what evidence was, talk about also what some of the problems that come along with evidence could be. So, how can we better understand the different categories of evidence as a way to predict where are we going to have the problems? What can we already be looking for as investigators to eliminate those possible errors and problems to make sure that our work is reliable and as valid and as effective as possible? And then we moved on from that and we started talking through some specific categories and types of evidence. So yesterday we spent most of our time talking about the difference between direct and indirect evidence. And then we also gave indirect evidence this other name, circumstantial evidence. All right. So direct and circumstantial or indirect evidence are two giant categories that include all possible pieces of evidence that we could ever find in an investigation. And the idea is that if it's direct, it is so specific and so clear from the very beginning that we don't even need to do any sort of interpretation or analysis. The reality is that's pretty rare. It's not very common. It is pretty common with digital evidence. And since we're getting more and more digital evidence in the way the world works, maybe direct evidence is kind of making a comeback and kind of showing up more and more often. But the vast majority of evidence that forensic investigations work with and rely on is in the circumstantial or the indirect category. Excuse me. And in that category, we also understand that it kind of has developed this reputation for not being super reliable. Well, the reality is that if all evidence or most evidence that we're working with in a forensic investigation is actually circumstantial, meaning it needs some sort of investigation, some sort of analysis or interpretation, as long as we do that work reliably and we look out for those possible sources of error, then we actually can show connections between that evidence and the conclusions we draw from it, and build an explanation of what happened in the scenario or the crime that we're investigating beyond a reasonable doubt. We just need to be aware of the fact that because there is some sort of analysis that needs to happen and that is done by humans, and humans are often pretty problematic, we need to look out for the possible sources of error, the possible mistakes in our interpretation or perspective, bias, things like that. And if we are looking out for those, if we understand the role that those can play, then we can actually prevent them in our process so that our work is as reliable as possible. All right, so that's kind of what we focused on yesterday. Now, moving forward, we're going to kind of dive into these categories, but we're also going to look at other terms that overlap and compare to these categories. So just because we go off in a different direction with more vocabulary doesn't mean that direct and indirect or circumstantial has disappeared. All of these different vocabulary terms, all these different types of evidence, they overlap with one another. And yes, there is probably a little bit of gray area or fuzziness, blurriness in the boundaries between the categories. That's okay. That's not a problem. But it does mean that we probably need a little bit more discussion, a little bit more practice, and some question time later on to make sure that we're all really clear on, okay, what do these terms mean and how do they apply to the different possible kinds of evidence that I'm going to find during the investigations that we do this semester. All right, so we're going to move on from there. Let's talk about the next set of terminology. Now, here we are not inside of direct or indirect evidence, but instead we're kind of alongside of them. So another way to categorize kind of all pieces of evidence would be in these three main categories, or these three big categories. Real evidence, which is also often called physical or material evidence. The next one would be demonstrative or documentary evidence, is actually probably a more common name. And then the last one would be testimonial evidence. Let's talk through each of those real quick. So real evidence or physical evidence, which is probably what a lot of you have in your mind when we think of like a crime scene, and especially the stuff that you've seen on TV, you know, CSI shows, NCIS, where we see them going into a crime scene or going into an environment where an investigation is happening, and we're looking for actual physical objects, items, markings, things that were left behind that we can physically recognize, look at, observe, and collect and remove from that crime scene for possible further analysis. So that's what we're talking about when we say physical evidence. And if you look down here at the bottom of the slide, you see there are some images of what that might look like. So a weapon, for example, that was left behind, evidence of somebody getting injured, so blood or things like that. It could also be things like fingerprints or footprints, or items left behind. Like here we see an image of a leftover a cigarette, things like that. Those are physical items, physical objects that we can enter a crime scene, recognize, identify, document, and then collect and remove. That's what goes into the category of real or physical evidence. Now, the next category is evidence that is created by investigators during that process of entering the scene that we're investigating, identifying mostly the physical evidence and collecting it up. The documentation that we create, we call that documentary evidence or demonstrative evidence. A really important thing to understand here is just because something is on a piece of paper, just because something is a document, does not make it documentary evidence. Documentary evidence is evidence that is created by the investigators as a way of documenting their investigation process. So earlier in the semester, we talked about the fact that investigators spend huge amounts of their time documenting their work to make sure that somebody else can come in and check over it or make sure that it's reliable, confirm that they did what they were supposed to do and that they did it in a way that is valid, legal, and reliable. Also, a way that is fair. So the evidence that comes from that documentation, things like a crime scene sketch or even a three-dimensional model, images, diagrams, photographs taken of the scene that we're investigating, all of those documents that are created, not found in the original scene, but actually created as a part of the investigation. That's what documentary evidence includes. Now, the last category, this is where we run into a lot of those problems that come along with human and culture and bias and social pressures and things like that. So testimonial evidence, this last category, is often looked at as the least reliable form of evidence, but it is pretty common because a really important place for investigations to begin, especially when a crime has occurred against another person, someone else has been harmed or their property's been taken, something like that. A really important place to start is, did somebody see something? And so interviewing possible witnesses or pursuing more information about the people who we suspect might have been involved by talking to their relatives, talking to their friends, talking to people in the neighborhood who might know them and have a relationship with them. That kind of information can be very valuable in an investigation, but the reality is it's based on me as a person, my perspectives, my bias, my own personal background and experiences, the way I understand and interpret things. And that means it's not necessarily going to be the most pure, objective understanding of what happened. It's my own ideas. It's my perspective, my opinion in a sense, right? And so that's where testimonial evidence, even though we have things like swearing under oath that you're telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, that's still the truth according to you. That's still your perspective. And while in, some cases and in a lot of cases, when we're talking about specific facts, what did you see? That can be pretty valuable to an investigation. It still is from the perspective of a person who definitely has bias and experiences that shape the way they understand what's going on around them, what they see, what they understand from maybe what they saw in a crime, for example, or any situation that's being investigated. So testimonial evidence comes with its problems, but it is very commonly used because we kind of want to know what people saw, and we use that as a basis. And then often we're looking for physical evidence to then kind of build on top of and confirm what other people saw or what they gave in like a witness testimony or a witness statement. All right, so we got three categories, big categories that hopefully we can fit all evidence into: real or physical evidence, demonstrative or documentary evidence, and then testimonial evidence. So these are not inside of the previous categories of direct or indirect or circumstantial. They are in addition to. So there's overlap. Things that are physical or demonstrative could fit into any of those categories. And it just depends on the situation. We'll talk more about that later and kind of try to give some examples for that as well. All right, moving forward, let's talk a little more about physical evidence. The majority of the evidence or the types of evidence that we will study and talk about and practice with in this class are going to fit into that physical evidence category. But there's two specific sets of words we need to talk about that go into how do we think about, how do we use, how do we analyze, and how do we evaluate the usefulness and the reliability of physical evidence. And so I want to kind of tell you those terms first, and then I want to go back and explain what they mean. So the first set of words is known versus unknown. And then the second set of words, questioned is another name for unknown, but we'll go over that in a second. The other set of words is class versus individual. So four terms that I need you you to be really clear on that all have to do with the way we work with physical or real evidence that we find at a crime scene or in during our investigation. All right, so let's go back and let's talk first about known versus unknown evidence. What we mean here is evidence that we know where it came from. We immediately definitely know its source or what person, what original source it came from, or evidence that we don't know that original person, that original source, that original cause of it being there. So known evidence is evidence that we know where it came from. Unknown evidence is evidence where we don't exactly know where it came from. And we're going to need to do some analysis or some interpretation work, kind of like what we saw back in the direct versus indirect, except for the fact that here, when it shows up in an investigation is probably very different. So unknown evidence would be, for example, the pieces of evidence or physical evidence that we find at a crime scene. So if you look at this little story down here at the bottom, trying to give you an example, several small drops of blood are found in a crime scene. After they are thoroughly documented, a sample of the blood is collected using sterile gauze, that's like a little piece of cotton that soaks up the blood, and sent for blood type and DNA analysis. Okay, so that blood that was found at the crime scene, we don't know how it got there. We don't know who it is. Now, we can probably analyze it. We can photograph it. We can look at the size of the drops and the way they're shaped, and that gives us information about maybe what caused them. But we don't know what their source is, right? We don't know when they got there. We don't know how they got there. We don't know whose blood that is. So this is an example of unknown evidence or unknown unknown evidence during our investigation. Now, in order to make sense out of that unknown evidence, we're going to need something to compare it to. So even though we know, for example, what type of blood that is, like type A, type B, if you've heard of blood type before, or we're able to kind of sequence out that DNA and figure out, okay, this is what the DNA looks like for the person whose blood this is. The problem is we need something to compare it to figure out, does it match somebody who was likely or possibly involved in this situation that we're investigating? So that's where the knowns come in. Read the rest of the story. The individuals who are suspected of possibly being involved in the crime are each asked to provide a blood sample for analysis and comparison to the blood found from the at the crime scene. So that's where the known samples come in. Okay, so during our investigation, we have identified these three possible suspects that we think maybe were involved. Maybe all three were involved. Maybe it was some combination, or maybe it was none of them. But what we're going to do is we're going to ask all three of those suspects to give us a blood sample, and we're going to compare those known samples because we know where each blood sample came from, right? Person A gave us blood sample A. Person B gave us blood sample B. Suspect C gave us blood sample C. And so we're going to compare those samples that we know where they came from, the known evidence. We're going to compare those to the unknown and see if there's a match. And if there is a match, then we understand, okay, that unknown sample is now known because we took the unknown sample and we matched it to a known sample. And now we know what the source of that blood was. We know that it came from suspect C, for example, which tells us that suspect C had to be in that environment at the time of the crime, unless there's something here that we're still trying to figure out, something else that we don't know. But according to the evidence, that person was there at the time, possibly involved, likely involved in the situation that we are investigating. So that's the difference between a known and an unknown piece of evidence. Now, another word for unknown that we will often see is this idea of questioned evidence. This is a little bit more of like a scientific idea that gets applied into forensics, but often in science, when we're talking about something that we are trying to identify, we call it either an unknown or a questioned sample. So questioned evidence is another term that we can use to substitute in for unknown evidence. Basically, it means the exact same thing, a sample of evidence or something that we are trying to analyze that we don't know originally where it came from. And so in order for it to be valuable, we're going to need to compare it to known samples in order to look for a match. All right. This doesn't just work with blood. This works with fabric. This works with fingerprints. This works with all sorts of types of evidence. If we have something that we don't know exactly where it came from or how it got there, we need known samples to compare it to in order to identify it and then figure out how did it get in that place and what role did it possibly have in the situation that we are investigating. Now, the next set of terms are kind of they connect to the idea of knowns and unknowns, but they are alongside of. So you can fit into either the category of known or unknown and use these other terms as well. So these other two terms we want to talk about is class versus individual characteristics, or class evidence versus individual evidence. The big idea here is class evidence is information or evidence, either from the scene or from information that we later find out through interviews and other parts of our investigation that fit into a bigger category. So, for example, finding a long blonde hair in the crime scene. Okay, we don't know exactly who that hair came from. We just know that it came from somebody that has long blonde hair. So that's a class characteristic. It's class evidence until we are able to analyze it further and match it to other samples. See, there's that known and unknown thing. Match it to other samples and try to identify where it came from using more specific characteristics, more specific techniques and analysis. And that's how we will do something called individualizing class evidence. We turn class evidence into individual evidence by looking for the unique characteristics that tell us exactly where that piece of evidence came from. Let me give you another example. Look at this picture of a red car here. All right, so let's say that the people who witnessed a bank robbery saw the people who stole the money run out of the bank and get into a red car and drive off. Okay, well, there are millions and millions of red cars. So anybody who has a red car is now a suspect. Well, we're going to need to be more specific than that. So the idea of a red car is a class characteristic. But if we can get more specific, things like the make and the model, the year of that car, it's not just a red car, it's a red Toyota Camry. It's a red Toyota Camry that was built in the year 2009. Right now, we've got specific details that help us narrow it down, except there's still tons and tons of people and tons of cars who fit that description of a red Toyota Camry from 2009. So we're going to need to get even more specific. That's why over here on the side of individual characteristics, we see something that is perfectly unique to every individual car. And that would be, for example, the license plate. Now, you're right. License plates can be changed or moved, removed, switched out, things like that. The serial number of a car, which is called the VIN number, the vehicle identification number, that is actually unique to every single individual car. But license plates are still pretty unique. And so what that means is we can take all the possible red Toyota Camrys from the year 2009 and we can go to like a police or a DMV database and we can look for whose license plates, and maybe there was a witness who saw a couple of the letters. Well, now we can start narrowing it down using those more individual characteristics until we find the exact right car that was at that place at that time. And we can go and find that car, or we can go look for that car and figure out who owns that car, who is in possession of that car, whose fingerprints or who possibly has had access to that car recently. Those are now going to be our suspects. So we're taking class evidence, big pieces of evidence that kind of come from big categories, and we're going to specify it way down to the individual unique characteristics of that specific original source. So that specific car, that specific gun, the original piece of clothing that this little torn piece of fabric came from. We're looking for the individual characteristics that help us figure out what is the source of that evidence. Now take a moment and let's think back. Okay, we got class versus individual. We also have known versus unknown, or known versus questioned evidence. What's the connection between them? Because there's a lot of overlap here and they are very tightly connected. So think to yourself, can you explain, okay, how does the idea of known versus unknown or questioned evidence, how does that connect to the importance or the role of class versus individual characteristics, or class evidence versus individual evidence? Think to yourself for a second. How does that work? All right, so hopefully the idea you're coming to here is, all right, I've got knowns and unknowns, meaning I find evidence in a crime scene. I don't know where it came from. I don't know who put it there, how it got there. It's an unknown piece of evidence, but I'm going to use the class characteristics of that piece of evidence to try to figure out, okay, what is this? Where did it come from? All right, well, maybe can now I start looking for such unique characteristics in this specific piece. Now that I've identified that it's a chip of paint that came from a red car, well, what are the more specific characteristics? Okay, well, this paint is used on these 3 models of cars, and it was used from this year to this year. So we're going to look for those cars. And then I'm going to go look for cars that are missing a piece of paint. Okay, well, now I'm getting closer and closer to those individual characteristics, which if we go back to the idea of known versus unknown, I had that unknown, and now I've got known samples I can compare it against, known cars that I can go out looking for. Who's missing a little piece of paint? Is it most likely to show up in a certain part of the car? Those are the things that help me take the class and individual characteristics and turn it into known versus known evidence that now I can make sense out of in my investigation. I can connect individual pieces of evidence, how it got there, what led to it being in that scene at that time, and make sense out of the people and the role it might have played in the situation that is being investigated. Now, over in the chat, somebody put, that sounds like a lot of work. Yeah, you're exactly right. It's exhaustingly difficult work. And it also includes, like we've been saying, a lot of room for error. So that's why it doesn't really work for forensic scientists or people who do forensic science work to be really good at everything. Instead, we need everybody to be really good at one really particular thing, and we need to know who's best at that, so that when we find this evidence, we can get it to the person who is most expert in that specific type of evidence or that specific type of analysis. And now we have used we've used our team in the most strategic way. So the way you kind of balance out all that work is you make it a team effort. You have multiple people collaborating together with different kinds of expertise, so that hopefully you've got the most reliable person doing the analysis, and other people there to check their work, check their possible bias and possible sources of error. And then we're able to kind of create the most reliable, the closest to the possible truth explanation of what really happened in that environment or in that scene that we're investigating. All right. We are going to move forward because now I've got some more vocabulary, but we're done with kind of big, broad categories, and we're going to get a little bit more specific. We're still inside the category of physical evidence. So these are types of physical evidence, but they overlap with the terms we've just been talking about: known versus unknown, class versus individual. Those types of evidence can exist in all of the next 6 categories that we're going to talk through. Okay. So let me kind of go through this next, set of terms. Now I see there's a couple of questions. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to pause on those questions and come back to those at the end. All right. So let's talk about, I forgot. Sorry. I've got some examples here. So there's a quote there from Jay Siegel, who we used earlier in our conversation. Let me just read this to you. Class evidence cannot be associated with one particular object or person. So that means it's not going to be very useful in an investigation if we're trying to convince a jury or trying to provide evidence that it was this specific person involved in this specific scenario. Continuing, individual evidence can be compared with an object from a known source, that's known versus unknowns, and if there are sufficient unique characteristics, so those individual characteristics in common, it can be concluded that the evidence arose from the source. This conclusion is based upon the premise that the unique characteristics, the individual characteristics, reduce the probability of it coming from another source to a level that can be considered to be insignificant. So this is where we get to the idea we're never going to be able to get the actual truth. We're never going to be able to prove it, but we're going to be able to come up with such a reliable explanation that it is most likely that this is the best possible explanation, the closest possible explanation to what the truth really is. And individualization is an important part of that. Now, here's an example of this that maybe you would read, maybe you would run into. So a victim has been shot. Analyzing the bullet of the victim that was found in the victim's body, the type of gun can be determined, okay? Except every handgun on the planet that matches that type could possibly be the weapon used in the shooting. So these are class characteristics. All right, well, later we identify a suspect using other evidence, the eyewitness testimony in this case, and a matching weapon is found in their home. Okay, so now we found out not only is this a person that other evidence leads us to, but they also have a matching weapon according to those class characteristics. characteristics? Can we individualize the evidence that we found to show that it was that gun by that person at that time and place? Further, if the found bullet's unique markings can also be matched to this gun using special analysis, the weapon and its owner can all be connected together to this crime. So that's an example of taking class evidence and moving it using those in taking class evidence that is unknown and using individualization, using individual characteristics to move it toward being a known sample. And a real life case where this is a really controversial issue is something that's often referred to as the Atlanta child murders. So there was this guy, Wayne Williams, who was arrested and convicted of a series of killings of children in the Atlanta area in the early 80s. And there's actually an entire podcast series that's specifically about this case. And they really struggled to find physical evidence to connect any suspects to the different cases, to the different crime scenes, to the different victims. But they did find there were these fibers, blue, yellow, white, and yellow green fibers of various synthetic types. And they were able later, once they had identified a suspect, they went to that suspect home and they found similar fibers in that suspect's kitchen, carpets, bedspread, throw rug, and car liner. So they found all these different places. Well, maybe this was the source of this fabric, or maybe this was the source of the fiber. And based on that, which is all class evidence, this suspect was convicted. Okay. Now, years later, it turns out that the victims' families never believed that it was actually this suspect. In fact, there were a lot of people in the community where this crime happened that were very skeptical that this was actually the suspect. And it turns out that there was some evidence in the analysis that the class characteristics of those different fibers, which was really the only physical evidence they had to go on, were not individualizable, meaning they were not specific enough or unique enough that we could connect them to those specific sources that were found in the victim's home. In the suspect's home. And so even though in this situation, class characteristics were used to convict somebody, the reality is that individual characteristics, individualized evidence is what is understood to be most reliable, because without individualizing that evidence, there was always going to be room for that reasonable doubt, including the fact that today there is a fair amount of skepticism that the person that's been in prison for these crimes for now 40 years is actually guilty. So those are just more examples of how these ideas of known versus unknown, class versus individual characteristics actually shows up in our investigations and the results or the impacts, the implications of our investigations. All right, let's go talk about those specific categories. So I told you there are 6 specific categories within physical evidence that I want us to talk about. All right, so the first is trace evidence. This is the broadest category. And this is really what Edmund Locard was talking about when he gave us the principle of exchange. He was talking about all these teeny tiny little things like soil, like fibers, like pieces of glass, like little tiny pieces of fabric, or even little tiny pieces of rock, soot, little tiny things that get left behind just from our interactions, our physical interactions. Those teeny tiny little fragments are called traces. And so this whole branch, this whole category of physical evidence, which includes a lot of different types, is called trace evidence. And so it's often really tiny, and it takes really careful observation and searching of the scene that we're investigating in order to identify it, document it, and collect it. There are a lot of the next couple of types of evidence that could often overlap with trace evidence. So trace evidence is a big category that other categories kind of overlap and fit inside of, but it is a very common type of evidence that is found, especially in a lot of those TV shows and movies and books that have these crime stories. This is what a lot of people fixate or imagine as being the kind of evidence that science allows us to unlock and make sense out of. Where did that soil come from? Where did that fiber come from? Where did that glass fragment come from? What kind of glass is it? Where did it possibly originate, and how did it get broken and brought into this environment? All of those kind of questions, that's what trace evidence helps us identify. All right, now to get a little bit more specific, let's talk about 5 other types of evidence: associative, pattern evidence, conditional, transient, and transfer evidence. So 5 specific types of evidence inside of the category of physical evidence that often overlap with some of the other terms we've already mentioned that I need you to be able to identify and explain. All right, so the first is associative evidence. This is kind of the most obvious one. This is where it is explicitly clear what person we are connecting to that piece of evidence. So it's something that has their name on it, their ID, their birth date, the date, the time, the place, the location. Those things are explicitly written down or obvious in the evidence. So something like somebody's driver's license that is inside of their wallet, that would be an example of associative evidence. If your name is on your notebook or an assignment you turn in for school, your name being on that paper, that's associative evidence. That's information that can associate you directly with that item. And so that is what's called associative evidence. It's definitely the most obvious type. It's the easiest to identify, but it is not that common because it's also not necessarily that helpful. Well, how did it get there? We understand that this is connected to a specific person, but who put it there? Was that person here? Did somebody take this from them and leave it here? It doesn't necessarily give us lots and lots of details, but it clearly connects to a specific person in some way. All right, let's go talk about conditional evidence. Now, conditional evidence is the one that I would say students most often get confused about. So if associative evidence is the one that's clearest and easiest to understand, conditional is the one that's most difficult to understand. It's not because it's particularly complex. It's because it's kind of blurry where it starts and stops, or kind of what are the boundaries that do and don't include evidence as being conditional. Basically, this is evidence that because of the time and place where whatever we are investigating happened, there were certain conditions that either contributed to that situation being able to happen or would possibly give us insight into how it went about happening or why this happened in that time, in that place. So this would be something like the crowdedness of a location. This would be something like loud noise in the background, or even the time of day. Those are the kinds of, the amount of lighting. Those are the kind of things that change throughout the day or change based on time and location. And so if you're not conducting your investigation at the right time, you're not going to see that these characteristics or this type of evidence is present in that scene or in that environment that you're investigating. The real clear thing about conditional evidence, it is something that most often repeats on a cycle, either a daily cycle, an hourly cycle, maybe over several days or weeks or months, but it's something that is likely to come back in the cycle of time. That's how we know that things are included in the conditional category. We'll come back to this in a minute when we talk about transient evidence, which is very similar to, but has some very unique characteristics. We'll come back to that in just a second. The next category, and this is the one that we see very often showing up in like CSI shows on TV, pattern evidence. Anything that we analyze based on understood scientific patterns. For example, fingerprints. We look for very specific patterns and markings in order to individualize a fingerprint that is found and connect it back to a person that is most likely to have a matching fingerprint. We look at the shape of blood spatter. So when drops of blood are found, we look at their shape and their size, the angle with which they most likely hit that surface, and we try to use that to work backwards to figure out, okay, well, what likely happened that caused that blood to go flying through the air and hit the surface? Those are the kind of patterns that we can study scientifically and then apply to all sorts of different situations. Tire tracks or footprints, things like that, right? They leave a three-dimensional mark. Now that is a pattern we can go and compare to known samples and try to figure out, okay, what were the characteristics of the original tire, the original shoe that left this print? And those patterns allow us to figure out more information about what maybe happened in that environment that we are investigating. And so these patterns are what we would fit, or any kind of evidence that we analyze using a pattern like that, or by comparing it to known patterns and characteristics. We're going to call that pattern evidence. A lot of times people get pattern and trace evidence confused. A lot of times trace evidence is super tiny, and so we're going to analyze it first by trying to figure out what larger substance did it come from. Pattern evidence, we're going to immediately identify what it is without having to do that extra analysis, but then we're going to start looking for characteristics or patterns that allow us to individualize it so we can figure out where exactly it came from. All right. And then transfer evidence. This is something that also goes back, just like trace evidence. In fact, it overlaps a lot with trace evidence, goes back to Locard's exchange principle. In fact, in a second, I'm going to put up a reminder that this is a really good example of Locard's exchange principle in action. Transfer evidence is evidence that comes from a physical contact of some sort. So when a person touches another person, when an object touches a person, or when an object touches another object. So for example, a car crash, right? A car hits another car, boom, you have paint getting chipped off and you have a dent in the cars. That is because of a transfer of energy. That is because of a contact between the two cars. That would be an example of transfer evidence. Maybe a more everyday kind of example would be if you hug somebody and a hair from your body ends up on the shoulder or on the clothing of the person you gave a hug to. That is because of a transfer between you and that other person. So the important characteristic that makes something fit into the transfer category is that it started in one place and arrived in a new place where we found it as investigators because of some sort of physical contact, either from an object to another object, an object to a person, or a person to a person. So here's an image to kind of remind you of that. In the scene of a crime, for example, there are going to be interactions between the scene and the victim, the scene and the person who's committing the crime, and the person committing the crime and the victim. There's going to be interactions, and all of those interactions can lead to likely transfers of little teeny tiny traces. Oh, hey, there's trace evidence, little teeny tiny traces that show us about those interactions. So transfer evidence a lot of times builds on trace evidence because it helps us understand, okay, now that we've identified where this evidence came from, what it represents, it's a dog hair, it's a human hair, it's a piece of dirt from this specific place, things like that. Now we can get a sense of what actual actions or motions and events happened in that space at the time and place of whatever we're investigating, and how did those things get transferred from their original source to their new the new place where they're being found. And so this is probably the best example of Locard's exchange principle in action. We see that there is through every single interaction that happens, every physical interaction that happens during a crime or during whatever sketchy scenario we are investigating, we see that those always lead to transfers of trace evidence. They're extremely common, and that they can happen in a lot of different places. So from the suspect to the victim, from the victim to the suspect, into the crime scene or out of the crime scene. And all of those transfers help us understand not just where the original source of the evidence was, but what happened to it and what kinds of movements and actions occurred during whatever situation that we are now investigating. All right. The last category of evidence inside of physical evidence I want to talk about, this is the one that kind of overlaps and gets confused with conditional a lot. It's called transient evidence. This one's probably pretty rare, mainly because it's so easily missed. Because it is so likely to be damaged or to disappear or to be contaminated, transient evidence is most likely really difficult to identify. So this includes things that just in a matter of time, very quickly, they are vulnerable to either breaking down and disappearing or changing. Transient conditions are the kinds of things that change very quickly. So for example, footprints at the beach, right? The ocean comes up and washes them away and they immediately are gone. That kind of situation, but that's pretty obscure, but in more common crime scenes. So something like a wet footprint. Well, if there's not a bunch of mud in there, it's just water, well, that's going to dry and then that footprint will disappear. That's an example of transient evidence. Smells, sounds, temperature. Now, I know I've got weather shown here on the slide, and I also had weather shown on conditional. The truth is that weather can kind of fit into conditional or transient, depending on how we're looking at it. But the idea is that weather often damages evidence, and so that makes that evidence more transient. The idea of transient evidence is once it's gone, it's never coming back. If you connect back to what we talked earlier about conditional evidence, we said that conditional evidence most likely is going to return. You just have to be in the right place at the right time to kind of witness that that aspect or that characteristic of the scene. Transient evidence, once it's gone, it's never coming back. Once it's damaged, once it degrades or disappears, it's never going to be visible again or recognizable anymore. So conditional evidence is something that could change but will likely return at the right time and place. But transient evidence is something that was there and can possibly disappear before we're able to recognize it, identify it, and document it. All right, so we've named 5 categories of physical evidence. We've also talked about the big giant category of trace evidence that goes along with those, and we've put those all inside of the bigger chunk of physical or real evidence that goes along with other big categories of evidence we talked about earlier today. Okay, in the last few minutes, I just want to mention one more set of terminology. We are no longer inside of the category of physical evidence. We're thinking big and broad again, and we're thinking, okay, what's the purpose of the evidence? What are we using it to do or to connect to certain people involved in our explanation of what most likely happened at that scenario or that situation that we are investigating? We have inculpatory, exculpatory, and corroborative evidence. Okay, so these are big categories that everything could fit inside of. If the evidence is inculpatory, that means we are using it to include a person or a possible suspect, a possible place, a possible object in our investigation. So what that means is, oh, hey, remember the red car? You have a red car. You are now a suspect. Or we know that the car was a '09 Toyota Camry that was red. Okay, so everybody in the local area who has had access to a red Toyota Camry within the last week is now included as a possible suspect. That's inculpatory evidence. The opposite would be exculpatory evidence. This is where we use evidence to exclude someone. So, oh, you haven't had access to a red 2009 Toyota Camry in the last week? Okay, you are not likely to be the suspect. You are not likely to have had access to something that we know was involved in this situation. Now, yeah, can you easily cover that up? Yeah, so maybe the car is not the best example. A better example of something like exculpatory evidence would be something like blood, DNA or blood type analysis. If we find that the blood at the crime scene is a certain blood type and your blood type is different, then now we have excluded you as being the original source of that blood. So it's exculpatory evidence. Now, the last category here, and this is all about just reaffirming other things that we have already found in either the inculpatory or the exculpatory category, corroborative evidence. To corroborate, sorry, it's hard to pronounce. To corroborate something means to reaffirm or to confirm and support something that we already know. So, for example, think back to the situation that we talked about maybe yesterday with direct and indirect evidence. The video surveillance footage of the person who walked into the bank and tried to rob the bank and threatened the bank teller with a gun. We had direct evidence where we caught their face on camera, recorded evidence. It was obvious that that person was doing this action at that place and time. But then we went looking for more evidence to support it. So we went looking for fingerprints, the weapon, eyewitness testimony. All of those things would simply be used to corroborate what we already saw in the direct evidence. So corroborative evidence is evidence that is not telling us something new or showing us a new suspect or showing us a new detail of the situation that we're investigating that we didn't already know. It's showing us, it's supporting, it's further convincing us, it's further confirming that the information we had already been able to pull out of other pieces of evidence are likely to be true. So it's kind of getting us closer and closer to that convincing or most likely true explanation of what's going on. All right. So that's all the evidence that's all the different categories we need to talk about. We probably need to go back through these and answer some questions. We probably need to clarify where the lines are between these. And if I ask you guys to go out and put this into action, there's going to be some of these that you're really good at right away because they're a little bit more obvious, and some that you're going to have trouble differentiating.